Everybody, thank you so much for joining. Hello, welcome. Welcome, everybody. Thank you. We're going to wait just a couple more minutes for more folks to join. If in the chat you would like to put your name and where you're calling in from and what you're excited to learn about today, please feel free so we can know where you're calling in from. Nice to see some familiar names on here. Thank you. Hi, Ellen. Thank you so much for joining. Wonderful. Thank you for joining. If you're just joining, we are going to start in 1 minute. If you want to write down in the chat your name, where you're calling in from, and what you're looking forward to learning, please do so. Great. People from all across the area. All right. So with that, thank you so much for joining. I know it's a beautiful spring day outside and we just had a wonderful hot weekend. We promise we did not plan that, but it definitely worked in our favor to talk about heat waves and going from snow days to heat waves in the Boston area. My name is Melanie Garate. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Climate Resilience Manager at the Mystic River Watershed Association, and I'm co-hosting this event with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council and the Museum of Science. And today we're going to talk about climate impacts on heat and health in the Boston area and all the different projects that are going on. Next slide. So just so you all are aware of, we are recording this event for the purposes of redistribution so that people can watch afterwards. So if you can't tune in for the whole meeting or folks weren't able to tune in, they can tune in afterwards. And just a couple of logistical things. You can definitely put down comments in the chat. And then if you have any questions for the panelists, we will be having a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So please click the Q&A button and add your questions there, and then leave the chat function for any general comments that you have. And we will send a recording and presentation and materials to you all who have registered next week. Next slide. Thank you. And we will begin by getting a warm welcome from Maya Mansfield, who is the Director of Climate Adaptation and Resilience in the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And then I will be presenting our speakers, and you'll be hearing about all of the great projects that are going on in regards to heat resilience in relation to climate change. So Maya, please take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Melanie, and thank you all for joining tonight and for inviting me to kick us off. I'm honored to help kick off this event and a critical conversation about the intersections of climate change, heat, and health in the greater Boston area. We know that temperatures are rising and that the state has already seen an increase of almost 11 degrees in its average annual temperatures, a decrease in 62 days or 2 months with daily minimum temperatures below freezing, and an increase in 64 days, another 2 months, with daily maximum temperatures above 90 degrees. We're also seeing continuing drought impacts across the state and project these to only increase in frequency and intensity, in addition to the continued increase in extreme heat days over the summer. We also know that heat impacts our most vulnerable residents most intensively and requires interventions across emergency response, planning and design, public health, infrastructure, and community engagement and partnership to address. Not only this, but municipalities, nonprofits, and regional planning agencies must work together to address this issue. At EEA, the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, or MVP, is supporting cities and towns in planning for and implementing priority projects to build local resilience to climate impacts such as extreme heat and flooding. We've awarded over $44 million to date among the 312 communities engaged in the program and are currently reviewing applications for the next $11 million in funding. Addressing the community and public health impacts of extreme temperatures is a priority of this program, and we're proud to have supported the 4 projects featured tonight on this program that exemplify many of the program's core values. They are grounded in climate change data. They are implementing and promoting nature-based solutions. They are focused on building resilience with and within environmental justice communities and are directly grappling with the relationship between the urban heat island effect and social inequities. They exemplify robust community engagement, and they are a strong example of regional collaboration. This event and the week of heat-focused outreach is a key component of these projects and allows each one to highlight its really unique and important approach to this critical issue. We look forward to seeing the results of these projects, the ways that they advance this important conversation through community partnerships in the Boston area, and the model that they set for other Massachusetts communities and cities around the country. So thank you all again for your work on this issue, your dedication, and your partnership as we work together to build a more resilient Commonwealth. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maya. And next, we're going to move on and introduce all of our speakers today. We have a wonderful lineup. If you could pull up the screen again. Jeanette Pantoja is a public health planner at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And in this role, she supports collaborative approaches to address the social and physical conditions that impact health outcomes and disparities in the Boston region. Her work focuses on the health sector's engagement and efforts to promote housing stability and economic mobility, and on the integration of public health into local climate change planning processes. And Jeanette will give us a climate and health 101 during this presentation. Joey Williams manages operations of the Kappa Heat Watch program, supporting local partners in a community engaged urban heat mapping effort to identify and address disparities in climate exposures. He combines his background in engineering and urban planning with care for human and environmental health to help the Kappa team advance climate resilience efforts with cities and communities around the US and the world. Sarah Benson is an education associate at the Museum of Science, Boston. Sarah's work is focused on engaging audiences of all ages about climate change, and more specifically around extreme heat and sea level rise. And Joey and Sarah will focus on the mapping effort of urban heat islands across the United States, and Sarah will focus specifically in the greater Boston area and the Mystic River watershed. Ibrahim Lopez Hernandez is a climate justice organizer with Green Roots, working on extreme heat, sea level rise, and social vulnerability projects in Chelsea and East Boston. He was born and raised in Puerto Rico and became passionate about climate change, urban planning, and just transitions after experiencing the impacts of Hurricane Maria in 2017. Dr. Patricia Fabian is an associate professor in environmental health at Boston University. Dr. Fabian's research combines expertise in housing, indoor air, respiratory infectious disease transmission, GIS, and system science thinking. And Ben Cares works as a senior planner and project manager for the City of Chelsea's Department of Housing and Community Development. Ben supports the City of Chelsea within urban heat migration, coastal resilience, community engagement, and open space and transportation planning and implementation. Ibrahim, Patricia, and Ben will talk about the indoor heat efforts in the Chelsea and East Boston region. And last but not least, Zoe Davis serves on the Climate Ready Boston team in the environmental department. As a project coordinator, she supports the development of neighborhood climate resilience planning, the integration of climate change preparedness, projections into municipal projects planning, and permit review. and the development of resources for residents, small businesses, and other stakeholders to take action. And so we will be talking about heat preparedness in the city of Boston. And so with that, I will pass it over to Jeanette Pantoja.
Good evening, everybody. So again, my name is Jeanette. I'm a public health planner at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Basically, what that means is that I try to promote healthier communities in our region that are inclusive to people of all ages and abilities. Next. So for those not familiar with MAPC, we are the regional planning agency for Boston and its suburbs, so for the 101 cities and towns of Greater Boston. And we work with these communities on a variety of different planning issues, inclusive of climate preparedness. Next. So we started a little bit off with this primer, but I'm going to review just some of the things that we can expect and the associated health impacts. So we know that our planet has been getting warmer for at least 100 years, and definitely within my lifetime, that has certainly accelerated. Next. The last 10 hottest years in the global record have occurred since 2000. And just last year, 2020, tied with 2016 for the hottest year in the global record. Next. And we can expect this trend to continue. So in the future, we can expect more days above 90 degrees, more frequent and severe heat waves, and we can expect hotter days earlier in the year, as we saw this weekend, and we're expecting later this week. So historically, we've had about 11 days over 90 degrees. And by mid-century, we expect closer to 41. So next. Our understanding of how climate change and health interact is definitely still emerging. And one of the reasons is because we really haven't invested in the science to help us understand how these two things are connected. You know, there's much more funding that's really needed in order to learn about, you know, how to diagnose within this area, how to treat, what are some of the potential co-benefits of climate action and public health. Next. But we do know a few things. So what do we know? We know that extreme heat interferes with our body's ability to cool down, causing a range of symptoms. Many of us have either experienced this personally or know someone who has. Heat exhaustion is just one form of heat illness. Other more severe forms like heat stroke, less severe heat cramps. And the symptoms might include things like headaches and dizziness, dehydration, pale, moist skin, weakness and muscle cramps, and more severely, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Heat can be deadly if it's not treated, and it kills more people annually than any other weather-related event. Next, please. Heat is definitely more harmful when combined with humidity because we can't cool off by sweating as effectively. And it's also a reason that it's really important that we investigate and implement strategies that are regionally appropriate. So there's a lot we can learn from the leadership of cities and towns in the Southwest, but the way that we experience heat is quite differently. And the temperatures at which we'll start seeing health impacts are different because of the acclimatization and humidity as well. Next. So I already talked a little bit about heat illnesses, but heat impacts health in several other ways, most strongly by worsening other health conditions. So heat can worsen respiratory illnesses and allergies. Heat in combination with increased precipitation creates conditions that are more conducive to infectious disease, such as mosquito or tick-borne diseases. Heat has been associated with preterm births, low birth weights, other maternal and infant health outcomes. Heat has been known to worsen cardiovascular disease and kidney disorders, and also worsen different mental health conditions. And for that kind of bottom row, some of the medications that people take in order to treat cardiovascular diseases or to treat mental illness can interfere with their ability to cool down as well. Thank you. So heat affects us all, but some of us are at greater risk. So infants and young children and older adults are less effective thermoregulators compared with adults, so they're less able to cool down on a hot day. People with pre-existing health conditions are more vulnerable for some of the reasons I described earlier. Same goes with people who are pregnant. People who work in hot environments, so note that I'm not just saying the outdoors. Through our engagement, we've been able to learn a lot more about the experiences of people who work in restaurants, people who work in people's homes, such as home health aides and house cleaners. People who experience social isolation, so either because they live alone, they don't speak English very well, they have a mental health condition that's associated with social isolation, and people who walk or take transit, and people without AC at home are significantly more exposed. Next, please. So, I talked a lot about vulnerability. A way we typically talk about it as planners is we look at 3 different factors. So if you can go to the next slide, please. There's our exposure. So how close are we to the hazard? Our sensitivity, things that are inherent to individuals that increase our vulnerability, so age and pre-existing health conditions fit within that. Our capacity to adapt or move out of harm's way, which is mediated by our access to information and resources. Next, please. And I think it's really important to note, while we're still in the middle of one crisis, that last summer was particularly difficult for a lot of folks, and many of the social inequities that increased vulnerability or disparities in who was impacted by COVID are the same social inequities that impact who experiences the worst outcomes related to heat. And so we know pretty consistently communities of color and low-income communities are more significantly impacted by both these crises. Next. We care about climate vulnerability because it's really important that efforts to mitigate climate change and build resilience need to prioritize these communities, and that the folks that are most impacted need to be active leaders and participants in these efforts. Next. MAPC is doing a number of things to address heat impacts. We've really picked up steam in the last year on this issue. The projects that are ongoing include the Metro Mayor's Building Resilience to Climate-Driven Heat Preparedness and Adaptation Plan that is MVP funded. The COVID Safe Cooling Grant Program, where we're providing funding in partnership with Myra to a number of communities to prepare for heat this coming summer, also last summer. And Keep Cool Somerville is a project that we've been doing in partnership with the city of Somerville for about 1.5 years. We're developing resources to integrate arts interventions with heat resilience strategies. That's really exciting work for us. And we have the peak demand management tool that we've had for a few years. Next. We also have a number of resources for community-based organizations and municipalities that they can use right away. So these are communications tools and more information that you can deploy in your own strategies. So I'll just wrap it up there and pass the baton to the next speaker.
Thanks, Jeanette. I think that ties really well into what I'll be speaking about today. Hi, everyone. My name is Joey Williams, and I'm the program manager for the Kappa Heat Watch program with Kappa Strategies, which stands for Climate Adaptation Planning and Analytics. And we're a group working to expand local capacity to address climate change. Today, I'll be talking about a unique and collaborative approach we're taking to understand the question of exposure. Which places across an urban area are warmer and cooler on a hot day as heat waves increase in intensity, frequency, and duration across the US. Next slide. Thanks. So the way we go about this is with a community engaged data collection campaign, essentially asking community members and collaborators like the partners here today to plan an event in which they will go out on a hot day using sensors that Kappa provides to measure temperature and humidity across the urban environment. They follow pre-planned transects and traverse across a variety of different land covers and land uses so that we can understand how heat varies based on the surfaces that cover the ground, the buildings that are present, the volume that may absorb and retain heat on a especially hot day, and also tree cover, which helps to mitigate the impacts of heat. And so Sarah will be speaking in a moment on how this is taking place locally in Mystic River and has in the past across the greater Boston area. Yeah, in the end, what we'll do with these traverse points that we'll collect in the morning, afternoon, and evening is to combine those with satellite imagery from the Sentinel-2 satellite and be able to create rich models of temperature and heat index across the full study area of the Mystic River watershed at morning, afternoon, and evening. And so this is a project that is taking place across the US with many different participants and collaborators. And so next slide, I'll show the way these maps, we've been seeing these maps and data sets be used is to better understand the distribution of heat at the human level. So by collecting ambient measurements, many tens of thousands, often hundreds of thousands of temperature and humidity points across an area, we're able to get at this greater resolution of heat, whereas previously satellite imagery, satellite-based temperature readings can be used at a coarser resolution. This helps us to kind of understand finer on the block scale, on the neighborhood scale, what's really happening on a hot day. And these are just a means to create an evidence base around which we can explore overlapping factors like the presenters have mentioned already, social vulnerability, how green assets are distributed across the city, factors of the built environment, such as asphalt parking lots or versus waterfront area or a shaded residential neighborhood. And then some interesting questions around how this relates to housing policy and historic inequities that are playing out today. And so many of these patterns in heat distribution, as well as the overlapping factors we see occurring in very similar patterns across cities around the United States. And so this is, like I said, part of an effort to create a means for better understanding these intersections and to also engage with communities and partners like the collaborators here today to co-generate this set of information that has some validity, that has some engagement and starts to build partnerships like we've got going in the Boston area, which is great. And so next slide here, we've seen these data sets and the engagement efforts be used in many different ways around the US, long-range climate action planning. In Richmond, Virginia, we've seen the heat data inspected along with ambulance data showing higher rates of heat-related morbidity and mortality calls for ambulances in the same places, of course, that are experiencing hotter days and hotter temperatures, and also overlapping with many of the social vulnerability factors related to heat. So they're really looking to provide a greater evidence base with this effort. And next slide, to also start to bring together folks in regional collaborations who bring the multiple perspectives that are needed to not just understand these data, but also to take action, to be able to entrench them in local planning efforts, public health efforts, and long-range visions of what we want our communities to look and feel like, and to play out in the long run. So we've now completed this assessment in dozens of cities around the US. And what I'm seeing here is a start to a regional effort to bring in others who are facing similar issues, have similar historic development patterns, historic housing inequities, and to put our heads together to create these better futures, hopefully in the face of a warming climate. So that's kind of the broad and big picture vision of what we're doing with the CAPA Heat Watch program. And I will turn it over to Sarah to take it back locally and describe what's happening in Mystic River this summer.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joey. So hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Benson. I work for the Museum of Science in Boston, and I'm going to be talking about our Wicked Hot Mystic project, where we are heat mapping in the Mystic River Watershed. So this project is in partnership with Mystic River Watershed Association, Town of Arlington, Resilient Mystic Collaborative, and really everyone on this call. And of course, thanks to funding to the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. Next slide. So first, what is the Mystic River Watershed? I know a lot of people on this call may live there, but if you don't, it is the 21 communities north of Boston in the greater Boston area. There's over 500,000 diverse residents within 76 square miles. So this project will be taking place primarily within the watershed. We did a lot of this work in Boston, Brookline, and Cambridge in 2019, and I can put a link in for that work. So this is kind of a continuation of doing this work throughout the entire watershed. So next slide. So what is the project? What is Wicked Hot Mystic? So we are going to be doing heat and air quality mapping through all 21 of those communities. And we have 3 main goals. And so the first goal is going to be community engagement. We really want to hear from the community, learn from the community, and really make sure that we are engaging with everyone who lives in these areas. Community members know their area best, especially when it comes to heat. They can really tell us the issues that they're seeing, how heat is affecting them, and really have this more two-way conversation between the researchers, the policymakers, and the community members themselves. So we'll be involving the community through every step of the way. First, doing education, second, the heat mapping, and then third, the data visualization. So the second part is that high resolution temperature data that Joey was just talking about. The third part is once we get that data back, making sure that we're communicating out the results. We can layer the maps with other factors like Joey was talking about as well. And we can really find the precise hotspots within the area so that we know and understand what neighborhoods are being affected most. Next slide. So there are 2 ways that you can help us collect data. So the first way is through ISEE Change. This is a free online platform. You can download it as an app on your phone or sign up for free online at iseechange.org. And what it really is kind of like climate change Instagram in a way, but you're able to incorporate a lot more data within it. So this is a really great way to get those qualitative thoughts from community members about how they're feeling around heat. So they can post, in these examples where they can use some shade areas that are great to cool off, how in this example, how a cat or animals are beating the heat, and really be able to get that information deep down from the community. And ISEE Change is really easy because through your location, it grabs the closest weather station and automatically imports temperature data for you. If you do have your own outdoor temperature sensors or indoor temperature sensors, you can also include that data as well to add a little bit more data to your posts. So it is free to use and it is a global platform. So even if you don't live within the Mystic Watershed, you can still use it. And it's not just about heat, it's about climate and weather in general. So you can really post anything that you're seeing. So next slide. So the second component is the urban heat island mapping that Joey was just talking about. So this summer in late July, early August is when it is the hottest in the Boston area. It has to be closer to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, no rain and low cloud cover. So we don't know the exact date yet, but we do know it will probably be late July, early August of this year. We will be collecting air temperature, humidity, and also air quality data. So on this picture is the temperature sensor that Kappa will be sending to us, but we'll also be attaching air quality monitors to all of the cars as well, and also using them on bikes and walking. So to do this, to map all 21 of those communities in the Mystic, we need a ton of volunteer scientists. So if you're interested, you can sign up. Next slide. So yes, how can you be involved? The first way is through being a volunteer scientist this summer. You can learn more at mos.org/wickedhot, or I believe Melanie will put in a form as well where you can easily sign up. And then you can collect data on your own time just by iseechange.org, either online or on your phone, and we'll be looking at that data as well. So next slide. So thank you very much. You can learn more about this project at mos.org/wickedhot and follow us on social media. We're all very active. So either at the Museum of Science, Mystic River Watershed, and if you want to learn more about the entire project and national project, you can follow NOAA Climate. So thank you very much. I'll pass it off to the next speaker.
Hi, thank you, Sarah. So thank you for the invitation to share some of our work. Our study is called Sea Heat and is a partnership with Green Roots, and it's funded by Barr Foundation. Madeline Scammell and I are associate professors of environmental health at Boston University and co-direct this project. And the project goal is to build capacity to respond to extreme heat in Chelsea and East Boston. Next slide. I want to acknowledge our team. It's a great team of students and researchers, our advisory team, as well as the Chelsea and East Boston residents who participated in our study last summer. Next slide. So why Chelsea and East Boston? First, all neighborhoods in Chelsea and East Boston are classified as environmental justice communities. There is a high environmental burden in both communities as well, including salt storage for de-icing roads, jet fuel storage for the airport, a large trucking facility, and others. Today we're focused on heat, and you can see from the map on the top left that shows land surface temperatures that there are many areas with high temperatures. And then as you can see from the map below, limited green space. So even with all the many challenges that these communities faced last summer due to COVID, as Jeanette mentioned, we were able to recruit residents to our study, again, really due to our great partnership with Green Roots. So understanding heat exposure is always important, but it actually became more important last summer with all the restrictions and closures. There weren't many places for people to go. We recruited 22 residents and for 6 to 8 weeks, asked them how they adapted to heat, what the health impacts were from heat, sleep quality. And then we also took measurements. So we gave people sensors for personal ones for their homes. And then we also put sensors outside all over the city. So as you can imagine, we had to be really creative because of physical distancing protocols, but everybody was great, creative, and we were able to collect a lot of data. So what have we learned so far? Next slide. One is that although people spend the majority of their time indoors, we knew that last summer, people spent a lot of time at home. COVID did change their habits. So 75% of their time indoors at home. 100% of our participants had some form of air conditioning, so just a handful central air, everybody else more window units or freestanding AC. But 80% of participants described their home as hot or warm, even though they owned AC. 38% said they had to make choices about which bills to pay, so that includes the electricity bill to pay for air conditioning. We calculated mean heat index, which, as Jeanette said, includes relative humidity combined with temperature. And you can see when outdoors, this is mean kind of over the 6 to 8 weeks, the heat index was 74 degrees, and then indoor, which would be in people's homes, was 77, and then personal 78. So that would be the one sensor that people were carrying around. Indoor temperature was higher than outdoors about 80% of the time. So the mean temperature on any given day indoors was higher than outdoors. And the temperature difference between indoors and outdoors was up to 7 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty high. Next slide. So what did people do to cool off last summer? So they turned on the AC if they could pay for it. They removed clothing, missing a G there, opened windows, even on hot weeks actually. And things that they didn't do were leaving the home for a cooler area. And again, COVID probably played a big role in this. Use a ceiling fan or close window shades. And hardly anyone actually had window shades, even the homes that faced south. Almost 50% of people reported that they didn't drink enough water. And a lot of people don't necessarily trust the water. So that was sort of an opportunity for education on the safety of our drinking water. And only 60% were aware of dangerously high heat and heat warnings. Next slide. Click again, please. This is a graph showing mean temperatures that we took from outdoor sensors. So these were all sensors we placed all over the city. And I just want to highlight that the coolest one is over here on the left, over on the park that's kind of in the southwest corner of Chelsea. And then the hottest one was on 3rd and Cherry Street. This was from maybe 32 sensors that we had in Chelsea and East Boston. And just the difference in temperature there was also about 7 degrees. Next slide. So what are we doing with all this data? We're sharing with the city, we're sharing with the community, we're trying to kind of coordinate and see how all this can be useful. One thing is sort of mapping things like where are the bus shelters, where are people waiting for them, and are there opportunities for planting trees or putting shading stations or misting stations? Next slide. This is the second area that is located also in kind of a local heat island, I'm going to call it, within the city. It's the southern area of Chelsea. A lot of people live there with a lot of vulnerabilities, like Jenna described, and it has potential for lots of interventions, including a white roof on the Boys and Girls Club, trees on the street, or greening an empty lot. And I'll turn it over to Ben so he can talk a little more about this area.
Thank you, Patricia. Good evening, everybody. As Patricia was alluding to, the City of Chelsea has received a Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grant to undertake some urban heat island studies within the City of Chelsea. Something that does make sort of our application novel is that we are planning to do some level of implementation projects for heat mitigation. So let's not get ahead of ourselves though. First and foremost, we did have to collect the external heat, ambient air, temperature sensors throughout the City of Chelsea. And so through that effort and in partnership with Weston and Sampson, as well as the CHEAT team for deploying the sensors and collecting the data, we're able to develop some ambient air temperature variability maps. And so these really helped us to ascertain sort of historical and existing urban heat islands, and also prioritize new urban heat islands that were cropping up in the City of Chelsea. Next, please. And so one such that Patricia had just mentioned was an urban heat island that cropped up in one of our denser environmental justice community neighborhoods here. And so, in terms of citing locations for implementation projects, we sort of targeted this neighborhood in particular. Next slide, please. And so Weston and Sampson has sort of mocked up some sort of conceptual ideas here for basically cooling a block of the city of Chelsea within this neighborhood. And so that does include a cool roof proposed for the Boys and Girls Club. And so that'll require some level of stakeholder engagement with them, as well as some sort of treatments to the surrounding pavements to make those lighter. And then the prospect of sort of increasing green open space of the of some of the sort of vacant parcels around there, and increasing canopy at the street level. And so basically being able to study that in the before and after condition can help measure some of the efficacy of these urban heat mitigation tactics individually and then collectively. Next slide, please. And additionally, we want to continue collecting data. And so we've partnered again with CHEAT. I walked right up to the executive director of administration and finance, and I said, we should paint our roofs white of our schools in the city of Chelsea. And she turned around and said, well, guess what? We're putting a new sealant on them. It's called White Night Sealant. And so we were fortuitous that that ended up being just by, incidentally, a white roof implementation project in the city of Chelsea. So our team with Weston and Sampson and then the CHEAT team with Green Roots and Boston University hopped right to it. And they mobilized to put some sensors on the roof there and then indoors at this particular school called the Williams School. And we'll be doing that similarly for some of the other school buildings in the city of Chelsea. And then again, measuring the efficacy of basically a white roof implementation and so in the before and after condition. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Ibrahim, and I'll be also talking a little bit about the summer plans for 2021 very briefly for the sake of time. Next slide. So in partnership with the city and with the CHEAT team, including Green Roots, one of the key strategies that we're going to try to implement this summer is a photo voice project. And this is specifically to try to record residents' perspective and their experience with heat. We think that this will be very informative in trying to develop policy ideas with the city and trying to get their or measure their preferences and what types of interventions, for example, would a community and vulnerable populations such as Chelsea would like to see. Next slide, please. The other one is youth involvement. So Green Roots has a cohort of high school students that work on our programs, and what we've decided to do this summer with them is kind of having us help with measurement with some heat guns. And so actually this cohort will be going around in green spaces and other areas of interest to get the land surface temperatures of these. So these could be mapped through a platform that we've been developing over the past year so that pictures, temperatures, comments, etc. can be done in a sort of collaborative mapping project. Next step and slide, there we go. And the other one very briefly, just for the quick background sake, redlining is one of the key things that we want to observe. If the redline communities such as Chelsea that was in 1938 redlined has higher temperatures than maybe some other areas. And this is particularly important since the residential use in Chelsea is very limited. About 38–40% of the land in Chelsea is for residential use. So it's a pretty important step to take and understand. Next slide, please. So this is the heat monitoring, as you can see with the guns. We also want to collaborate with the city and the CHEAT project in Green Roots into trying to create a parcel of land that might be available for us during the upcoming year to try to green it. And so we want community input from that, but also measuring and getting data out of it to see the process of an undeveloped parcel, turn it into a green parcel, and what are the benefits in terms of extreme heat mitigation and resiliency. And next slide. And lastly, in relation to Jeanette's comment about the BAR COVID Safe Cooling Grant, the municipality of Chelsea, City of Chelsea, and Green Roots are also partnering up to see if the hydration station that has been set up starting last year with funding from BAR could be expanded. And this is important because there is a lot of focus for indoor mitigation of extreme heat, but we are also conscientious that with COVID or any other scenario similar to COVID, outside options are also pretty important for our vulnerable communities. And so by extending this network that could be built upon to create a a network of misting stations in green spaces, community members could really benefit. And we're trying to have at least 99% of the buildings in residential zones covered by at least one of these misting stations. And about 62% of them households would have around 3 stations in a 10-minute walk time. So trying to build that network so that if folks don't feel comfortable or simply cannot use the AC and have to go outside and maybe they don't feel comfortable going to a cooling center such as a library, there are other options available in the community. I think that's it. So I'll pass it to the next speaker.
Hello, everyone. My name is Zoe Davis. I'm a climate resilience project manager with the City of Boston's Environment Department. Within the Climate Ready Boston team, I'm serving as the project manager for the city's heat resilience study. So today I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the ongoing study and share about the premise, some of the modeling that's been done, and talk a little bit about how we're thinking about building out the resilient solutions. Next slide, please. So the heat resilience study is that is also being supported by the MVP program, is part of Climate Ready Boston, which is the city's initiative to prepare for the impacts of climate change, both in the near term and the long term. Next slide, please. So many have touched on this earlier, but we know and we are experiencing already the impacts of climate change, including extreme precipitation and sea level rise, coastal storms, and of course, extreme heat. And we know that these are projected to increase as climate continues to change in response to greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. And as Jeanette pointed out at the top of the presentation here, these are some of the impacts that are projected for summer temperatures, an increase in average summer temperatures as a whole. As was noted, we saw almost 90-degree day in late May, when the summer averages are supposed to be around the 60s. We expect to see an increase of the number of heat days and also an increase in more frequent and longer and hotter heat waves. Next slide, please. So in response, the city is developing citywide solutions to reduce urban heat that will also address the associated health and economic and infrastructural risks. It's what we look to address that we're currently facing today and will face in the future. And so to an extent, we have an understanding of the types of built environment interventions that can be implemented, such as green roofing, cool paving, energy retrofitting. So the question really is that we're trying to answer with this study, what are the barriers to implementing these solutions? How do we measure what has been put into place so that we can make sure that it's working when we put it into place? And how do we troubleshoot when it's not? What are the provisions that must be in place to make sure that the interventions are developed by and implemented by and work for the folks who have been historically left out of the equation and folks who experience the greatest risk due to extreme heat? We're also asking, how can we add measures and metrics to understand the health impacts that are affected by what we build? And what are the programmatic and policy elements that are needed to strengthen and support the implementation of these solutions? So there's a number of questions that we're looking to answer here. And we know that there's been a tremendous amount of work that's been done, exemplified through the number of folks who have presented here in this space, as well as through our academic partners, various other organizations and other city departments. And so the goal of this study is really to build on the existing work with the goal of getting at some of those unanswered questions and filling in the gaps and developing a coordinated approach to reducing extreme temperatures. Next slide, please. So the heat resilience study is citywide. We recognize that the entire city is relatively hotter than much of the surrounding areas. However, the study is focusing on hotter areas across 5 neighborhoods, including Chinatown, Dorchester, East Boston, Mattapan, and Roxbury. So these focus areas were selected for their heat risks, as well as the widespread impacts of systemic racism that include environmental injustices and planning histories that have elevated heat exposure and health vulnerabilities in these neighborhoods. So the goal here is that by doing deep dive studies into some of the hottest areas and studying their characteristics, we can bring those learnings and solutions and apply them to other areas of the city. Next slide, please. So before I move on to the modeling, I just want to note really quickly that the heat resilience study is actually a project that is working in close coordination with 2 other related projects, among many, but working really closely with the Urban Forest Plan and the Open Space and Recreation Plan as a part of Healthy Places Boston. So when we had when these projects were in development, we realized that the topics that the topics within these projects, such as heat, trees, health, open space, recreation, overall well-being, these aren't siloed concepts, and they're very much so interconnected. And so, realizing that we need to, in the development of holistic solutions, that we need to be both internally coordinated and have also coordination with external communications. We wanted to develop Healthy Places as sort of a one-stop shop where you can find all of the information that you need on these 3 related and concurrent projects to avoid confusion and also create that one-stop shop approach. So you can visit Healthy Places and get more information on all 3 of the projects if you so choose. Next slide, please. And next slide. So onto the heat modeling. The purpose of the modeling work is to look at the spatial distribution of heat characteristics in Boston. So what you're looking at here are 2 images of land surface temperature. The one on the left is what's currently existing as a part of the 2016 Climate Ready Boston report. The one on the right is the new modeled surface temperature from an image that was captured on a late July day in 2019. And so by generating new maps like this, the purpose is not to recreate what is already existing, but actually to add another layer, which is the urban canopy characteristics. And so what's been added here are is the normalized difference vegetation index, the NDVI, and this essentially tells you how much light is being reflected by vegetation. So we did this in order to test performance of the air temperature modeling, so that there could be a comparison made between the land surface temperature data and the modeling that's being developed. So what you're seeing here is the areas in blue are areas where it's 85 degrees, at least 85 degrees. And then the deep red areas are where there are temperatures of up to 127 degrees. And so you'll notice that the red is seen along the major corridors, such as the Expressway and the Red Line. And then you can see some of the more cooler areas, such as Jamaica Pond and JP and Franklin Park and Roxbury. Alrighty, next slide. So this is a look at the air temperature modeling. Just to save some time, I'll give just a really brief overview. You can see here that the air temperature modeling actually follows very similar, the high heat areas follows very similar patterns with the densely urbanized areas. Next slide, please. This is also the air temperature modeling here, but it's a look at the nighttime air temperature. So what's a critical takeaway here is that there are areas in the city that remain hot, and there are areas in the city that cool down at night. And so we're taking a look at, within the project scope, the areas that don't cool down, especially. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so just as a quick overview here, we also, as part of the heat island analysis, we are taking a look at the history of redlining here. And so you'll see, especially with some of the study project areas, the areas such as in Roxbury, the South End, and East Boston, those are heavily redlined areas, which you can still see remain hot to this day, versus in JP, where it is a little cooler and it was a grade A area. Next slide, please. And next slide. So just really quickly, an overview of the framework that we're looking at in terms of resilient solutions. You know, we're currently doing that gap analysis of looking at the existing infrastructure and trying to understand what exists, what support is needed, and what types of support should be supplied or applied. So just to look at our draft framework here. And then the final slide here, just a plug for upcoming events for the heat resilience study. We do have our COMAP, which you can access. If you scan the QR code, it'll take you to a survey and a really cool map where you can tell us the areas that are too hot, the areas that you go to stay cool. And secondly, I just want to plug, we do have our first open house that is coming up this Thursday from 7 to 8 p.m. So if you want a deeper dive into the data, or just have more in-depth discussion about heat resilience study, I'll see you there. All right, and I'll turn it back over to Melanie.
Thanks so much, Zoe, and all of the panelists. We really appreciate you. I'm sure everybody learned lots of great things, but also have lots of questions, since there was a lot of information all at once. And for that, I'm going to introduce Sasha Scheideroff, who works for the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, who will be moderating our question and answer session. So Sasha works on a variety of clean energy and climate projects, including supporting the Metro Mayors Coalition Climate Preparedness Task Force. This task force is a 15 municipality coalition that collaborates on preparing the region for climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And Sasha also co-manages the COVID Safe Cooling Strategies grant program. And so I'll pass it off to you, Sasha.
Great, thanks, Melanie. And thank you again to all of our panelists for amazing in-depth presentations on all of the work going on in our region around heat preparedness, public health, and other topics. For all the panelists, I will ask you to take yourselves and put yourselves on camera so we can see your lovely faces. Great. So a couple questions did come into the chat in the Q&A, and I wanted to give Ibrahim a chance to talk a little bit about hydration stations. There was a lot of interest in understanding what exactly is a hydration. Is it more than a water fountain? And then wondering if they're only used during the summertime.
Sure. So yeah, it was for the sake of time, but yeah, a hydration station is basically a public water fountain. It's a fancy name, but the model that has been already implemented in Chelsea, there were 2 of these models before last year and the pandemic hit. And with the opportunity of the BAR grant, that was a rapid grant last year, Green Roots, along with the city of Chelsea, strategized on implementing that particular model that lets further work on them into converting them into misting stations. So also having that added value and benefit for the community. And so there are about 8 right now in Chelsea, and about 25% of those buildings in residential zones have at least 3 within 10-minute walk time. And what we want to do is try to increase that by as much as possible. And what the plans right now is doing a temporary misting station with collaboration from the Boston Society of Landscape Architects. And that temporary measure for this summer is to get community input into how they feel how should they look like, how should they function, etc. We want community input in this process, and then being able to do a more permanent solution, hopefully across the whole network, so Chelsea is covered as much as possible.
Great, thank you. Jeanette, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something related that I'm starting to encounter even as we get into this summer, is that there's a lot of infrastructure in our community that is poorly framed as amenity, extra, nice to have. That includes drinking fountains, hydration stations, it includes benches, it can include splash parks, pools. But, you know, last year, one key struggle that we learned about is that folks who are unsheltered, experiencing homelessness, didn't have an alternative place to get safe access to drinking water because most establishments were closed and a lot of the drinking fountains were turned off because of public safety concerns. As we go into the summer, it's really important that those drinking fountains be brought online again. And I've also heard that, you know, some communities are a little bit reluctant to install this infrastructure because of the maintenance needs, or they have a set schedule where we don't turn on this infrastructure until after, you know, June 1st or like a set date later in the summer. But when we're in a scenario where we're starting to experience 90 degrees in May, it's important that we be more responsive to the conditions in our community than to this like strict schedule that we have historically had.
Yeah, that's a great point. In addition to extreme temperature days of over 90, we are also seeing the shoulder seasons, spring and fall, also warming up. So the next question is, several presentations spoke about the importance of understanding and addressing indoor heat and housing quality. What strategies or initiatives are municipalities, nonprofits, and community organizations using to mitigate indoor heat, and what more will need to be done to address air temperature in homes?
I can start. So I do think indoor exposures in general are really understudied. I think there's a huge focus on planting trees, putting white roof screen shading, which is really important. But again, you know, as we said, people spend most of their time indoors. They did before COVID. They will after COVID as well. Maybe not as much at home, but still indoors. There's already programs, for example, Mass does the insulation and air sealing, which is really more about energy retrofits, but that actually improves the quality of insulation in homes, prevents infiltration, and then makes it easier for, say, air conditioners to keep up. I know there's new initiatives, for example, people who come into the hospital for heat illness or heat exhaustion get a prescription for an air conditioner. And then if they qualify also for subsidy for paying for electricity, because it's not just getting an air conditioner, it's also having the ability to pay for it. There's a lot to be done around window shades, I think, education around whether you should open your window when it's really hot or not. Heat index, which relative humidity matters a lot. I think there's a lot to do also around cooking. So people not knowing that you either need an exhaust fan that's going to push all that humidity out of your house when you're doing a lot of cooking and boiling, etc. Or even maybe thinking of dehumidifiers as a way to kind of bring the heat index down even when it's hot indoors. So those are sort of some ideas I would say for indoor. There's a lot more to do, and I think that we need to turn our attention to indoors actually as well.
Anyone else want to take a go at talking about indoor temperature?
I can discuss, well, we did recently submit for funding to target some of the most vulnerable populations to extreme heat, which is often, you know, low income seniors and specifically isolated seniors. So, you know, as a municipality and sort of working with our Department of Housing and Community Development and the Department of Public Works, we do realize that we have some capacity to roll out AC units, either mobile or sort of fixed. So those are either window units or ones that can sort of plug in their rooms. And we would go through a self-qualifying sort of application and coordinate with the senior center, as well as other housing authorities to target a small a small chunk of highly vulnerable residents and sort of deliver AC units to them with a utility rebate, as well as sort of, obviously translated materials that would connect them to other resources that could help them in a more long-term and sustainable fashion kind of reconcile increases to their energy usage, and sort of think about, using that as also a communication pathway to think about retrofitting their internal spaces for energy efficiency and the like. So municipalities can do it at the local level, but we do need grant funding. And so it really ends up being kind of these smaller acute efforts, but it's certainly possible.
Great. So there was also a question that came in, I think that's related somewhat to the indoor cooling around electricity grid and sort of resilience of the grid and opportunities for battery storage, as well as what we can be doing in terms of that. Because as we know, as more and more air conditioners and fans get turned on, we're using more electricity, putting more demand on the electricity grid, burning more fossil fuels. And was just wondering if, I think, Ben, maybe if you want to share a little bit about some of the resilience efforts and how you kind of see that tying in.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, thinking about climate resiliency and climate impact, oftentimes we come to this question of sort of emergency management and emergency response. And I think probably the worst thing that a blackout presents, total energy shutdown of, a chunk or all of a municipality, is sort of the impact on emergency operations. And so the city of Chelsea applied for a MAPC Accelerating Climate Resiliency Grant to implement a battery storage system for the city of Chelsea, first and foremost. There's plenty of other buildings in the city of Chelsea that could utilize that type of system. We really wanted to run a pilot program of it. And so that's why we sort of selected City Hall. There's a lot of stewardship there with the Department of Public Works. Their office is right there. We can sort of oversee the maintenance and sort of assess its efficacy. And then we would expand out to the police department, as well as some of the more affordable housing complexes and sort of housing authorities of the city of Chelsea. And so we are thinking about that. Obviously blackouts present, sort of a symptom of all this extreme heat, high energy usage across the board. And so we certainly are starting to embark on a citywide, backup battery storage coupled with microgrid systems to increase the resiliency of our energy system as a municipality.
Great, thank you. We also had a question from an audience member about the redlining data. And I know several folks talked about the impact of historic redlining on current urban heat islands and access to green space and trees. So I'm wondering maybe who wants to take that on, and someone wants to first talk about what redlining is. Maybe Ibrahim or Joey wants to take a first go.
Sure. So with a quick definition about redlining, it's been a concept that has been gaining a lot of momentum over the last years, and the implications that it has had in terms of climate, in terms of public health nowadays. And so it was the practice of specifically an institution called the Homeowners Loan Corporation during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. That actually facilitated home ownership. And the practice was that it was overwhelmingly white homeowners who managed to get access to that funding and then the creation of wealth. That also had a systematic effect of not having the green lined or the preferred areas of investment for home ownership to be in a space of lack of investment. And that includes also public utilities. It included also land use repercussions, where a lot of the commercial and heavy uses, such as industrial uses, were preferred there since the home values were considerably less and not really wanted to be protected. And so that has clear implications, and there are academic research papers and other gray literature examining the relationship between extreme heat and those redline communities due to the high amount of impervious surfaces that historically was deployed there. I don't know if anybody else wants to chip in.
I think that you explained it really well, but I just put a link in the chat of a story map that's really helpful to learn a little bit more about redlining and how that affects things like heat, tree cover, impervious surfaces. So to be able to visualize it a little bit more.
Great, thank you. Let's see, my next question for the panelists are that several of the presenters spoke about the need for more robust data collection and analysis for extreme heat and rising temperatures. What are the largest data gaps and what types of information is needed, whether it's qualitative information or storytelling or doing the community organizing in order to be able to do the planning and policy work? And what have you seen as making successful partnerships between researchers and those doing the work on the ground? Maybe I'll turn that back over to Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'll try to answer some of that. But yeah, the need for more data collection and analysis around extreme heat. Heat is something that is so hard to visualize. It's really hard to see. And so all this work that we're doing, I think, is really important because it's not something that in the Boston area we usually think about that much. I mean, that's the whole name of this panel, right? We think about snow days, we think about hurricanes, flooding, sea level rise. But heat is something that we are learning more about and should be concerned about because of the climate change aspects and public health aspects and how everything is linked. So it's been really great to hear about all the projects that are happening. And I think what's really also important with heat is that it doesn't affect everyone the same. And so I think you just asked how we can end up working with the community and policymakers and other institutions can work with everyone. I think that's a huge aspect of extreme heat because it's really important to learn and understand the community and where they're feeling the effects of heat and how they're feeling it and what the community would like to see and have in their neighborhoods. I think heat is tricky because it affects us differently, but also it affects large spaces. So how do you go about and try to figure that out exactly where to start? So hopefully a lot of this data that we're collecting this summer and what everyone else is collecting will help us to pinpoint some of those hotspots around, at least for us, for the Mystic Watershed, to be able to work with the community and start bringing some solutions around heat.
So I guess just building a little bit on that. So gaps we talked about a little bit, right, is sort of really what the impact is on lived experience, which to me means a lot more community engagement and listening to communities. Every community has their own personality. Every family has their own personality. So, you know, why you have certain customs or how you cool off and different needs and different vulnerabilities. There's no one size fits all. It's easy to look at a map and look at hotspots or look at green space, and you really need to dive into the community and understand how they work, how they communicate, what their social structures are, because all of that is part of building resilient communities to heat. So I think bringing community engagement into everything that we do is critical. That's one thing. Second is just getting all the stakeholders to talk to each other because, you know, researchers, I'm a researcher, I'm an engineer, I live in the data world. I love maps and data and sensors, right? The community, you know, that's not what they're worried about, nor should they be. And, you know, the city has their priorities and their funding and the consultants theirs. And so I really do think there need to be more forums where everybody comes together, kind of shares what their vision is, and then you kind of line up the vision for everybody because that's how you can move forward. So I think there's not that much funding that way, right? There's funding for cities, there's funding for communities, and more now we're seeing kind of this kind of combined funding that brings all stakeholders together. But we need a lot more of that.
I wanted to jump in on this question too. And like I briefly mentioned in my presentation, we've been working for the last 1.5 years with the city of Somerville on the Keep Cool Somerville initiative. And it's been a really powerful and educational experience for me because, you know, we've really started from a place of just asking residents in Somerville, what do you currently do to keep cool? And the range of responses is really great and kind of helps you reflect on like what are some people's experiences. For a lot of the folks we've been talking to, they're immigrants that are coming in with their, the reflecting on how climate change has impacted their home country, what practices they do right now that are like culturally specific to keep themselves and their families cool, and really leverage on that kind of cultural sensitivity, I think can help create more successful strategies. This question of data gaps is also a really great place to partner with folks in the healthcare space. I know that there is a lot of emerging interest within the health sector in the Boston region to partner on these issues. But in the last couple of years, they've really stepped up their game around social determinants of health. So the conditions that people experience outside of a clinical setting that impact their health. And they've done a lot of work to try to understand what people's housing stability situation, so their housing situation is, whether they're experiencing food insecurity. And we're hoping that they can bring in kind of this climate lens to also, as they're doing a screening with a patient in a primary care setting, asking them, do you have access to AC at home? And if you don't, how can we connect you to resources that can help you safely cool at home? Also, surveillance data that they could collect to try to understand like who's ended up in the ER for what reasons, at what temperatures, could kind of help us better tweak our strategies.
Great. Joey or others, did you want to add anything on this question of sort of the nexus between research and working with community members, and how do we get good data for policymakers and decision makers and community groups?
Sure. I think these are all fantastic perspectives that we've seen here. And in the projects described, I think each of those kind of, in terms of the spatial data, heat data that communities are getting at, each seem to serve a different purpose for adaptation efforts, whether it's stationary sensors to better understand what's going on the ground, land surface temperature to look at what's happening on rooftops and on pavement, air temperature, and as we'll do this summer, to look at the intersection with air quality. I really, would just level up what Patricia had to add about community engagement, hearing that as such an important aspect in cities across the US, and more like the qualitative data, like you mentioned, Jeanette. And so yeah, all of those bring together and serving kind of a piece of a greater purpose. Yeah.
Great. Anyone else want to put in an answer?
Yeah, I can speak to this a bit. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, just I can speak to this with regard to more so internal coordination and data collection. So one thing we've been thinking a lot about and actually looking at is the ways in which we're already connecting with residents, like existing programs, and things like that, as sort of our way of data collection to understand where some of those gaps might already be. So I think a lot of what we've been looking at and talking about is looking at existing infrastructure so that we can start to, I guess I should say, target improvements in some way. So for instance, we've been trying to understand what some of the barriers are to folks accessing cooling centers, or instead of thinking about access, why is it that folks don't use cooling centers at all, regardless of access? Maybe it's a matter of interest. And so just taking that data and starting from there and sort of trying to take a step back and look at all of the connections that we have across various departments as sort of like our data points to build out.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think there's important work to be done to connect all of these pieces together. Let's see, we had a couple of questions and comments in both the chat and the Q&A following up on some of these equity issues and the redlining conversation around how sort of the denser urban core is experiencing more extreme temperature, but also having pressures around affordable housing, and this sense that perhaps the suburbs aren't doing their share in terms of getting affordable housing built. And how do you, I think the question really looks at how do you balance all of these needs regionally in terms of housing, resilience, green space, access to green space, and how do you make sure that it's done in a way that is equitable and also increases equitable access and doesn't just recreate some of these inequities that we were talking about. So I don't know, Jeanette, if you want to take that on first and then others can follow up.
This is a tough question, and I think Ben, you had said that you could maybe answer it from Municipal. I'll give it a first shot because I'm not as familiar with the research, but okay, balancing. What we do know from the vulnerability is that a lot of people's experiences of heat are like closely related to their experiences of home. And so, you know, a lot of folks who experience they're living in an overcrowded condition and an unstable housing situation. They're crammed into an attic or a basement apartment. They also experience high utility burdens in connection with their high rental costs. Like they are pretty consistently folks who are more likely to experience extreme heat impacts. And so access to affordable, stable housing is critically important. That is like a really important resilience strategy. And so I think it's important to look at these issues holistically, right? Like removing trees in order to develop housing is like a loss in one measure, but it's not necessarily like a net loss. And I just want to be really encourage people to be like really careful and nuanced about these arguments, because we also hear them a lot in the suburbs, where the risk of potential tree removal is like starting to be an argument that we hear like increasingly more often as an anti-affordable housing development argument. So I think I just said something maybe that is not going to make everybody really happy. And now I'm just going to turn over and see if anybody wants to save me here.
Any of the other planners on the call want to speak to it?
I can sort of jump off from Jeanette. I think Jeanette did a wonderful job explaining this. Like this is one of those questions that is really at the heart of what it means to be like a city planner and a research. It's extremely interdisciplinary. So there is no good answer to this question. It's not a matter of just, you know, our grant programs, the way that those are administered and the way that we receive funding has a very specific use and sort of takes a very specific form. And so you do see a lot of these projects sort of overlapping with one another and talking a lot about, you know, whether it's external or internal implementation protocols. We aren't really focusing on, you know, bringing developers into the room or bringing, you know, political officials into the room to talk about housing, because I think right now things tend to be a little siloed between departments. And so I think an answer to this question is certainly, you know, interdepartmental relationships. Some of the things that we answered before about bringing researchers and everybody sort of into the room to have these conversations starts to make a lot of those connected pathways, and we can maybe start to think about, the trade-off between, removing trees and building affordable housing, or maybe it's sort of energy resilient housing. At least from the city of Chelsea's perspective, our land prices are extremely high. It's very difficult to develop things that are palatable for developers. So we are already fighting tooth and nail for affordable units. But to add sort of to the mix this prospect of energy efficiency or maybe even green roofs, you're certainly driving up a lot of those hard costs. And so I think the answer to a lot of this is sort of advocacy to federal and state levels to contribute more funding so that we can subsidize some of those harder costs of retrofitting or maybe building new affordable housing that's energy efficient, or maybe expanding green spaces. But I think that, projects like ours that reach out and engage community members and increase sort of advocacy around those spaces is a really logical first step in sort of lobbying for those types of efforts, because there is no direct answer. If there was one, then we'd probably already be doing it. And so, questions like these are just that connection of what it means to be a holistic planner and to think about them like that. So I thank you for your question, because I think it really stimulates a lot of people's brains around the concept. And I hope that through all of our efforts and sort of what we do and package together, that'll be a piece of the puzzle that we end up, constructing as, state of Massachusetts, whoever, to sort of address, some of those more intersecting issues around housing and sort of urban heat mitigation and sort of open space.
Great, thank you. So we're closing in on the 7:30 mark, and I just want to thank all of the panelists and speakers today for sharing with us all of your knowledge and work. And we have 3 more minutes, so if we can do a lightning round, would love to hear if you have one recommended action, whether it's locally or within your community or at a state level. What is one recommended action you recommend to folks who are listening in for that they do this summer, and how can they get more involved? So I'm just going to call on you all as you are in my screen, and hopefully you've been thinking about this. So I'll turn to Sarah first.
Hi, yeah, thanks. My one recommended action would be to keep the conversation going and to talk about heat with your neighbors, your grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, whoever it is, to talk more about heat and educate about heat. It is something that is so hard to see and so hard to really look out for. So to keep an eye on your neighbors and everyone around you, I think would be my tip for this summer. As we saw yesterday, it's getting hot already, so start doing that, I guess, now in May. And yeah, you can learn more at mos.org/wickedhot. So thank you.
Great, thanks. Over to Ben.
So sorry, I was focused on the chat. Could you just reiterate what I'm answering?
What is your one action you would recommend folks do this summer, and how can they get more involved? And we're doing this as a lightning round. So I'm gonna skip over you and go to Patricia, and we can come back to you at the end.
So building on what Sarah said, I would say, look around and find vulnerable populations around you, share about resources. If you need to buddy up with someone who's older and needs to have the air conditioning put into their window, or just check on them on a hot day. That's my one, since we're doing lightning, I have a lot.
Great. Ibrahim?
I also have a lot, but one quick, maybe fun one would be count your water fountains in your community, or go to your local government and ask for a list if they have one. And maybe that would be an interesting conversation on water availability for this very hot summer coming up.
Great. Joey?
I'm gonna say get to know your neighbor. If you haven't even chatted with them, met them before, that's a great first step to building your community resilience, and also to participate in our study if you have the chance. To learn more on that.
Great. Zoe?
Yeah, I think I have to reiterate what others said. Check on your neighbors if you're not already. Get connected with your local neighborhood association. If you're interested in participating in the City of Boston Heat Resilience Study, visit the city's website.
Great. Jeanette?
The checking on your neighbor is very popular, but for a very real reason. That's what I was going to say. Yeah, if you're a municipal staff person here, like check in with your colleagues and ensure that you have drinking fountains, that they're all turned on, critically important. If you're just a resident, maybe have a conversation with your next physician visit to ask them like what their awareness is of this issue, because we really need people in the medical community engaged as well.
Great. And then I'll turn it over to Ben, but also ask Elise to share the last few slides, and I promise we're wrapping up.
Thank you for a second chance. I would say, keep your eyes on your own city and municipal calendars. I think a lot of people miss out on, meetings like that are about urban heat or even climate change, where you can sort of get connected to resources and be a better advocate when you do end up having those conversations with your neighbor or, someone that that might be vulnerable. So I'd love to see more participation in my municipality for sure. So that would be my suggestion, because there's a lot of municipalities doing this type of work around the region, I'm sure, this summer.
Great. So just a warm thank you again for our panelists and a few sort of wrap up pieces. So just a plug for our Metro Common 2050, which is our regional plan that we're getting feedback on our policy recommendations. So if you have any feedback, we have a link on mapc.ma.policyfeedback. Next slide. Ways to get involved. So some of the projects that you heard about on today's panel are ongoing right now this summer. So volunteering with Wicked Hot Mystic, taking our community survey on experiencing extreme heat. This is in particular for our Metro Mayor's heat preparedness plan, but it's an open survey to the whole region. We would love to learn more about how people are experiencing heat in their communities and their lives. And then creating your personal cooling plan before the next heat wave. So whether that's staying at home or finding a cool spot or going to a friend's house or going somewhere that has cooling, thinking that through ahead of your heat wave. Next slide. And then just some more information too. We do have, as Jeanette mentioned, a lot of resources on MAPC's website, mapc.org, Planning 101 Heat Prep 2021. And we'll also be putting the recording of today's event on our website as well. In the next slide. And just also want to thank all of our co-hosts. So thank Mystic River Watershed Association and Melanie and her team, the Museum of Science Boston with Sarah and her team, the folks working on Wicked Hot Mystic. We also would love to thank all of our funders, the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, and thank Maya for speaking and opening up, and the Barr Foundation as well for their generous support on these issues. So I would just love to thank everyone again for attending tonight. And I hope that you stay in touch and reach out to us if this issue is something that you care about and piques your interest. This is a kickoff to our week long of Heat Prep Week. So we'll be sharing lots of information throughout the week online about how heat is impacting health, air quality, our electricity grid, and many of the topics that we covered today. Melanie, do you have anything to add before we hop off?
I just want to say thank you again to all the panelists and also all of the attendees who stayed with us until the end. Thank you so much. And to all of you who are watching perhaps in the future. And I would like to say that I also agree we should all check in on our neighbors, on our family members, and also make sure to register to vote and elected officials who incorporate climate resilience planning into their priorities.
Great.
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thanks all.
Have a great night and stay cool.